Instead of quietly escaping to seek help, the driver, whose name was Walker, exited his vehicle armed with a Thompson submachine gun, stealthily approached the Japanese, and launched a surprise attack, forcing them to retreat. And he would receive a medal for his bravery. Now, a troop sergeant, major named Hugill, stationed at a outlying observation post connected by a field telephone to the main post, received a Distinguished Conduct Medal for his calmness in continuing to call in artillery fire, creating a protective wall around him after being cut off by the enemy. Once the attack subsided, he made his way back to the main observation post, but stumbled across some isolated Japanese soldiers who had just captured a Vickers machine gun. Ugill quickly gathered 5 other infantrymen and he led a bayonet charge to reclaim the position, which is kind of ironic. It's giving the Japanese a taste of their own medicine, I guess. Emergency.
Banzai.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you can scream banzai at them.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I couldn't resist.
Emergency Commission Officer Lieutenant Edgar Newland, who was commanding a platoon of about 30 men from the Leicesters. Sorry, I keep saying that differently. What's the pronunciation of that British term of that area in the world of Britain?
Leicester.
Leicesters. Okay. God damn, I keep saying like. My bad. Sorry, Britain.
I only know this just because Leicester City is in the football in the Premier League.
There you
That's
go.
how I know it.
Leicester's in one of the most forward positions of the defensive lines during intense attacks and counterattacks. His platoon was cut off, and he was surrounded for much of the battle. Yet Newland and his men successfully repelled numerous assaults and held their isolated position for 2 consecutive days. General Percival specifically praised Newland and his men for their crucial role in defending Kampar. Newland was awarded a military cross, while his regular platoon sergeant, Ewan MacDonald, would receive a Distinguished Conduct Medal. It's moments like these, where forces engaged in fierce combat, reveal the extraordinary nature of, heroism and bravery. Often the individual actions in battles are overlooked, and, these are the kinds of stories we should share, because it highlights what it was really like to fight in these situations, certainly bloody ones. Now, after 2 days, the Japanese managed to capture part of the eastern sector of the location known as Thompson's Ridge. I'm trying to look on the map. It's very small, but you can see it here. I can actually zoom in for a second. Right here is Thompson's Ridge.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going back. British battalions, including a Punjab battalion, made unsuccessful attempts to recapture it. Morrison believed the British defenders needed rest before launching another counterattack, so he sent 2 platoons of Sikhs and Gujars to bayonet charge Thompson's Hill under some mortar fire. Now, tragically, 34 soldiers would die, including their 21-year-old commander, Charles Lamb, who was killed in the initial charge. The second commander, Captain John Graham, lost both of his legs to a grenade, but he continued to encourage his men, and he was seen throwing a grenade at the Japanese trenches before he bled out.
Yeah.
That's a hell of a scene.
That's like going down fighting. That's like the truest definition.
Yeah, that's Hollywood movie moment stuff right there. Ultimately, courage, artillery, and favorable terrain would be insufficient to actually hold Kampar. Yamashita decided to outflank Percival by maneuvering around Kampar with a series of seaborne landings, and I think I can pull up my map. Not sure if it shows the sea. It doesn't exactly show, but you can imagine here in this. I don't know if you can even see my mouse cursor, but he would make what we call a naval hook, basically. So he would go around.
I guess it's
them.
Around that where we see that kind of U-turn around Telok.
Yeah, I believe that would be that one. So it was actually a series of seaborne landings along the western coast where 40 small craft, some of them being used in Singora and Patani Islands and others by rail at Alor Setar. Tsuji opposed Yamashita's plan to do this, by the way, arguing that using the crafts would put them at risk as they were needed for the upcoming assault on Singapore. Because the Japanese had a very limited amount of small vessels, I guess you could say. They're not transports by any means, that they would need to cross over to hit Singapore Island. Despite the objections, Yamashita ordered the landings near the port of Telok Anson, located about 30 miles southeast of Kampar. The forces managed to get behind Percival's 11th Division, 11th Indian Division, which were fiercely defending Kampar, as you can imagine, and they were going to be cut off in this process. Yamashita also he devised a 3-pronged attack. One prong would involve a fresh Imperial Guards division arriving from Thailand, who would paddle down the Perak River directly into the town itself. Another prong would approach from the west on landing crafts to enter the river from the opposite direction, and the third prong would move up the Burnham River, land about 50 miles from Perak, and then march north towards Telakansan. Lieutenant General Takuro Matsue of the Japanese 5th Division was going to be commanding these landings.
Yeah. Was the Guards division still symbolic, like how we had the armies of Europe with their Guards divisions being their elite and best? Was it still true for, would we say that would be applicable for the Japanese
Yeah,
Guards?
so the men, like most of these symbolic divisions, the men were chosen for their height, so they and their physicality. They would have to be quite strong, but particularly the Japanese really wanted to be the tallest guys, because it was a psychological kind of factor to like scare the enemy. But in this particular case, they weren't elites. They weren't trained any better than anybody else. I don't want to say they're paper tigers, but they don't match other groups like the Germans would put out. This is not a real elite force. So despite being called like the Imperial Guards, they this particular one isn't
Yeah,
anything
I guess
special.
one of like just because Guards units, it kind of takes me back to the Napoleonic era
Yeah,
because
exactly.
we know like the Imperial Guard of Napoleon, that was his ultimate fighting force.
Yeah, yeah, that's like you don't
And
waste them on anything unless you need to. Yeah.
you know the situation screwed up, like
Oh
Russia,
yeah.
1812.
Exactly. Now, while the British held the line at Kampar, 1,500 Matsue's men crowded onto landing crafts, navigating the coast and trying to identify various gaps in the mangrove hedges. One steamer, towing about 10 landing crafts, went too far south and attempted to enter the Selangor River, which was defended by a Jap battalion supported by artillery. The Japanese were repelled, losing one of three landing crafts before moving further north, which is a terrible loss for them. They needed every single landing craft they had. Within Perak, Matsue faced a significant setback when four landing rafts ran aground on a sandbar at the river's mouth and required rescue. A British patrol boat actually would spot them and left a report of the situation, leaving the Japanese vulnerable and exposed. Nothing happened, however, as Percival would later remark, here's a quote, unfortunately, neither the Navy nor the Air Force were able to take advantage of this unique opportunity. And it would have been quite an opportunity.
Well, wouldn't
Just
they have the army also have had guns? Also, they could have trained a couple of them on
Yeah, but
this
I guess
coast.
it was a secondary thing in the grand scheme of things when they're fighting for their life at
True enough.
Kampar, but I don't know. Despite the setbacks, the Japanese forces managed to land and advance on Telakansan, and on January the 2nd, they encountered the 3rd Indian Cavalry and the 1st Independent Company. Under Stuart's command, these troops were equipped with armored cars and additional Thompson and Bren guns, allowing them to engage the Japanese in the narrow streets of Telakansan. They inflicted significant casualties, but with only about 250 men, they were unable to hold back the enemy. Stuart ultimately decided to order them to conduct delaying actions instead of attempting to actually defend the town. Consequently, the defenders began to impede the Japanese advance on the main north-south road, but Telakansan would ultimately fall. This left the defenders at Kampar at risk of encirclement and destruction. Although Kawamuro's forces at Kampar showed no signs of actually breaking through, and after 4 solid days of fighting, they were losing a lot of men, Paris was troubled by the possibility that his main supply road up to Kampar had just been cut off. Obviously, that really is kind of an endgame scenario for you. He requested permission from Percival to withdraw to the next defensive line behind the Slim River. For Paris, the priority was to preserve his troops rather than territory, ensuring that when reinforcements arrived to Malaya, he would have enough men to launch a counterattack. He stated at the time, with no reserves in hand, we were still in a position of being unable to accept major losses. Thus, it fell to the 12th Brigade to keep the enemy at bay while Paris organized a safe withdrawal with the rest of the division, which would have been the first real withdrawal, not just a bunch of guys like fleeing for their lives, like an orderly retreat, as you would say.